Like, so the World Memory Championship, to compete at that level, you've got to memorize 5 decks of cards in under 5 minutes, randomly shuffled. You've got to memorize random numbers, up to 10,000 random numbers, and you've got like 10 minutes to memorize 10,000 random numbers. And people just train for it. There's this great book by Joshua Fjord called Walking on the Moon with Einstein, where he started studying these people. And he thought that they had some natural God-given gift. And they were like, no, it's just training the brain to work in different ways. And so he trained with them. And 2 years later, the reporter went back and placed second in the world in the world memory. It's a fascinating book. And it goes through just all these techniques. And so I've been practicing them since I was a kid, kind of enhancing my normal abilities that I had to improve.
How did you figure this out?
Oh, figure what out?
Like that you had this ability?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I prefer not to add. It was just something I was good at. You know, growing up, I loved reading. My parents encouraged reading. I was a voracious reader. And just over time, I realized I was reading at a much faster rate than other people. So I would read like 3 or 4 books in an evening. And my mother would be like, you know, go to bed, go to bed. And I was like, no, there's another Heinlein book. There's another Asimov, because I love sci-fi. And all of a sudden I was reading like, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 books a day.
I don't think I read that many books a year.
Yeah.
I listen to books.
Yeah, I found podcasts really, really difficult because the rate of input was so much slower compared to how I speed read, because I would kind of just see the page and kind of scan it. And I would just like, it would freak my girlfriend out because when we used to travel, I'd bring like 2 suitcases of books to last like a 1-week vacation. And I was like, you have your shoes, I have my books.
I can imagine being able to do that, but that's an incredible, like, do you not even have to pause to just kind of take it all in, the page in?
Yeah, I just kind of flip, and it's there.
Well, listen, Austin, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Long time coming.
Yes.
We've been talking about this for a couple of years, really.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the vulnerable world hypothesis or thesis. But before that, it's like the opportunity to sit across from a cypherpunk. It's not something I get too often these days. So I'd like to dig a little bit into the background. I'm sure you've talked about it hundreds of times, but lots of listeners won't have heard too much about the early history of the cypherpunks. Can you just dive in, like start anywhere you want, but I'd love to just know about like how you first became or came across this group of people, how you first became involved with them.
Sure.
Take me all the way back.
Well, growing up as a teenager, I was kind of experimental. I was an old school hacker. Mm-hmm. So I explored computer networks. Some I was allowed in, some I wasn't, but that was the only way to get access to the kind of early internet. And so, but while still a teenager, I kind of realized there was no future in this. So I started a career as a teenager as a security consultant where I would do red team attacks. That was one of my very first companies. So I would get hired by companies to break into their systems and show them the vulnerabilities. A lot of my friends got arrested by the FBI in an early operation called Operation Sun Devil, where they essentially made hackers enemy like number one and violated their civil liberties. It's what led to the creation of Electronic Frontier Foundation. Mitch Caper and John Gilmore and who was the third founder? It was Mitch, John, and John Perry Bowler, who we miss incredibly, great person. They created EFF as a reaction to this. So early on, the civil liberties and the internet really mattered to me. So I was tracking kind of the early discussions that were going on pre the creation of actual cypherpunks, the mailing list, when John Gilmore and kind of that group created the cypherpunk movement. I was already involved. I was tracking the early battles around PGP that were happening. I cared about encryption. So I sold my first big company in 1996. 1994 to 1996, I had started an internet provider, raised some capital, and ran one of Canada's largest internet providers, kind of like the Earthlink dial-up internet of its day. I was co-founded it with my brother with investments from my dad, and then we merged with another and kind of I was the CTO. So I was running fiber into Canada, running all their data centers. We sold it and came into a bit of money. Not totally life-changing, but for that age, it was significant.
How old are you?
This would have been, so it was 96, so I was 23.
Nice.
Yeah. But, you know, it was significant. Our dad, who was our angel investor, made more betting on his sons than he had in pretty much most of his career as a CFO of public companies. And
Even better.
yeah, and so it was nice. And we were kind of thinking as a family, what do we want to do next? And I had this thesis. I was like, the same way Netscape changed, browsing to make it easy and accessible for everyone. I said, what if we could build like the Netscape of encryption tools, the Netscape of cypherpunk tools, something that is just so transparently easy that the UI would make every email encrypted, every person would have a pseudonym, totally unlinkable pseudonym, so that different parts of your life could never be linked, and you had an email address for every part. And all your internet communication was routed over an anonymous IP network based off the idea of WADI, PipeNet, which was based off David Chome's DCNet. So I basically took all the best cypherpunk technologies, untraceable pseudonyms, some of the work that had been done with anonymous remailers. I looked at Hashcash that Adam had built and invented for anonymous remailers. And I was like, what if we build a cypherpunks lab, hiring all the best cypherpunks in the world, and we commercialize these technologies in an easy-to-use UI? So we called the company Zero Knowledge. Mm-hmm. We went on to raise $75 million. We hired our chief scientist, was one of the original cypherpunks, Dr. Ian Goldberg, who's invented a whole bunch of encryption algorithms, at the time broke SSL. He was very, very instrumental, although doesn't get credit. He still runs the best security and privacy academic research lab in the world out of Waterloo and teaches people on all sorts of cypherpunk technologies beyond Bitcoin. I hired Adam back. So I called Adam. I knew his work. And so it was 98. I called Adam in England. I said, you need to come work for us. He picked up his family and moved to Montreal. We tried to buy DigiCash. DigiCash went bankrupt, and I was one of the bidders. I couldn't convince the VCs to sell it to me, because we were going to take the patents and make it free.
Okay.
And we were going to release anonymous eCash, because that was the missing piece. So the idea was, if we had anonymous identities, anonymous IP, and anonymous payments, we could build the internet that wasn't based off surveillance capitalism.
Okay.
And we could build an alternate economic model for the world. And we could embed at the base layer of the internet privacy and anonymity. So we got in a lot of trouble. We released a hack on the Intel Pentium serial number chip, because Intel released a chip that had a serial number on it that they said would track you across the web. And they promoted this idea that we would put a permanent cookie on your chip. And they said, but you'll be in total control. And we were like, screw that. So we released a hack that showed that a remote attacker could exploit it. And Intel hated us. So we were all over the news as privacy advocates. We were very vocal. We got a lot of press. This is pre-Google, so a lot of this stuff disappeared. We grew to 280 employees. We did one of the first actually eCash mints. So we couldn't use the Shome eCash patents that got locked up. And this is why we're so against patents at Blockstream and in my career, because patents have actually stopped the progress of cryptography. First, the RSA patents prevented us from doing tons of encryption. Then the Shome patents got locked up and owned and prevented the development. So a lot of the original cypherpunks were all anti-patent. And John Gilmore and I actually came up with this idea of an open source GPL patent license that would actually protect patents. That's part of what Blockstream was funded to create. I told my investors we're going to patent anything we can and give it away for free as long as no one has any other patents. And that's formed the basis of the defensive patent license that's at the heart of Blockstream, that's now being used by Jack and being used by the Bitcoin community to protect against patent trolls. So there was a lot of stuff that went into it, but we got too big for our ambitions. We totally misjudged the market for privacy, because people say they want privacy, but they make horrible decisions about it every day.
Yeah, I think the problem with privacy is that to achieve high level of privacy online is actually quite a lot of work, and you have to give up quite a lot of useful tools. I went through a process after a Jameson Lopp interview of trying to just give myself more privacy on my phone, and it was little things like Google Maps became almost unusable. Just little things like that. So it's difficult for a couple of reasons. I think technically, people who aren't competent with technology can make simple mistakes, which they end up giving up some of their privacy, and also the convenience side.
Yeah. Well, we actually developed, so we had a tool that ran on your computer. You just picked which identity. It would automatically scan to see if you were leaking data. It would replace it with your pseudonyms data. It would automatically alternate your emails. So it would essentially be like a small AI agent that maintained a siloed identity. It routed over an anonymous IP connection, something we called freedom.net, which was built kind of or at the same time that Tor was released. But we worked with the guys at Tor developing the techniques. We ran the very first attacks on large-scale anonymous IP networks and detailed here are all the ways our system could be attacked, because we believed in security through transparency, not security through obscurity. It was all built off cypherpunk ideals. We ended up acquiring the patents to the only other way to do eCash at the time, which was Dr. Stefan Brands, who was David Schoen's PhD student. He figured out a better way to do eCash than blinded signatures, or at the time a lot of people believed. It was a lot more extensible. And so Adam wrote the toolkit, and we used it ourselves. So we issued anonymous tokens, because how do you pay for your pseudonym where we don't know who you are? So the entire idea was we never could ever break, even with a gun to our head, we could not tell you who one of our customers was. And we actually had the FBI approach us a number of times because one of our pseudonyms would do something illegal, and we just said, we can't. And we did it all from Canada, where we could export military-grade encryption, because in the US it was illegal at the time. Circa kind of mid-2000s, the dot-com crash happens. I had raised tons of money. We were running a heavy burn rate, but at the time that was okay because all these companies were going public. And, the market just wasn't there. I've made a famous joke at a conference. Bruce Schneier ended up using this. I said, if you grab 100 people and put them in a room and ask them if they care about privacy, 97 people will put up their hand. 2 weeks later, if you grab those same people for a different survey and ask them if they're willing to give up a DNA sample in exchange for a year's free McDonald's, 94 will put up their hand. And I said, that's kind of the problem, is that privacy is ephemeral. It's a long-term thing that people don't generally make good decisions about. Same way a lot of people talk about, I care about the environment, but they'll go out and buy 2 SUVs because it's convenient for them. And so, 9/11 happened. A lot of people thought we shut down the Freedom Network and all our services in response to 9/11, but it wasn't that. We had actually already planned. We just economically, we could not keep sustaining all these cypherpunk R&D projects. So the company had to go through a massive retooling, which was really painful. I had to fire a lot of the scientists that I had convinced to move to Montreal and work with us. We went from 280 employees down to 58, which was, we shut down a lot of the advanced R&D projects. But we were working on eCash projects with Nokia that was supposed to put anonymous eCash in everyone's phone. We were really trying to build a cypherpunk world. And unfortunately, just business requirements, we had to migrate into something that was more economically viable, which was to sell security, like desktop firewalls, antivirus, anti-spyware. And we innovated at the time we knew the ISP business because my brother and I had run an internet provider. We were the first people to kind of make it easy for an internet provider to bundle security tools. So when you got your broadband connection, we did it with Virgin, we did it with Verizon, every broadband provider. The provider, you call up and say, hey, my broadband's slow. They said, can we initiate a spyware scan remotely? They would scan your computer, find all this spyware, and say, for $5 a month, do you want us to protect your computer? And so we changed it from going to the retail store and buying Symantec to just buying it from your telco as an add-on. And so it was all branded by our partners, but we built the tools to tie into the call center, to tie into their billing system. And it became a very profitable business, less exciting from my personal privacy goals. but we got it up to, $70, $80 million a year in revenue. But at that point, my heart wasn't in it anymore. We had lost our youngest sibling. I come from a very large family, and we lost our youngest sibling to a battle with cancer. He was 18 when he was diagnosed, given 6 months to live. We kept him alive for 2. And I had taken a break from the business to study cancer and build his medical team and to kind of lead his fight against cancer. So, my heart wasn't in the business anymore.
Uh-huh.
My brother was running it, and coming back after that sabbatical, I was just,
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. So I left and went and started doing startups, started investing in local entrepreneurs, tried to build a gift economy game based off Burning Man principles because I've been studying post-scarcity economics, like what happens after money.
Yeah.
And I really believe that gift cultures move. When you get past the singularity and you actually have a culture of full abundance, where all resources are essentially free, where do you end up? And you end up usually in gift cultures. And
Explain the singularity in terms of what you've explained here.
well, different people talk about different things, but at a certain point in exponential curves, you end up on a vertical curve where kind of all things become possible at almost an exponential rate. So it's impossible to imagine. And so the Ray Kurzweil singularity thesis says sometime around 2037, 2040, we will reach that point where we have AGI, so some form of AI that is almost semi-aware, or applied neural networks that are close, indistinguishable enough that we'll have full access to material science, nanotech, nanoassemblers, so we'll be able to conduct and create buildings, objects, program our reality with robots. And we'll have full access to biotechnology. So we'll be able to do that at a nanoscale level inside of your body. So genetic immortality, reprogramming our bodies, reprogramming organs, reprogramming our environment. And so when you end up in this type of world, there's some sci-fi writers like Cory Doctorow who wrote Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom about this world where everything is possible. So what do you actually build money around or an economy around? And he contemplated something called woofie, which was this social capital, which was essentially your karma score. So if you were an asshole all day, and everyone has brain-computer interfaces, and if you were an asshole and everyone determined you to be an asshole, you could come home and find out that your apartment was 80% smaller because nanoassemblers had taken away your right to space.
It's very Black Mirror.
Oh, it's fascinating. So we were playing around with the idea of what if we could build a karma society, a pay-it-forward random acts of kindness based off gift culture. And so that was a COA. It was fun, but I missed a few things, But I was also very active in investing in companies. So I invested in a bunch of startups, started playing the role of VC. Fast forward kind of 2009, 2010. Went through a bad kind of breakup with my kind of then time fiance. I just had been too work obsessed. And so I was just burnt out. I'd been building companies since I was 16 years old. I was like 36, 37. The love of my life and I just broke up and I was just kind of lost. So I went and played poker professionally for a few years. Hired a bunch of poker pros to teach me.
How'd you do?
Good and bad. My ego played too heavily initially. I walked in and I was
Always the way.
Playing high stakes, and I'm like, I know what I'm doing. And then all of a sudden I start studying leaks in the game and I start realizing that I'm the whale at the table, that other people are taking advantage of leaks.
The fish.
Yeah. So I went down a level, humbled myself, hired some pros, hired some experts, and I got pretty good. I'm able to hold my own and kind of, and I know when I'm out-gamed, and I know not to sit at certain tables. Come 2013, now friends had been calling me since 2010 about Bitcoin. And they were like, Austin, it looks like eCash is finally invented. And my answer, frankly, was, fuck you, don't call me on this.
Why?
I was traveling the world playing poker. I was nursing a broken heart. I didn't even look at my email for 3 months at a time. I literally was so traumatized by 20 years of living in my inbox. And frankly, I had spent $8 million trying to build eCash. I had to fire all my friends who built it for me. And I was like, I'm glad someone figured it out, but I really don't want to go walk down memory lane right now, right? Like I just wasn't emotionally in a state where I could get excited about someone else solving it, because I was, just still dealing with putting some, trauma, frankly, together. And I just didn't want to think about business. But, I kind of looked at it and I was like, okay, it looks like, it's a workable system. I'm glad someone's figured it out. I hope it scales. Because all these systems, we had seen these systems. I had seen, every other BitGold. I had seen all these attempts, and no one ever got one to scale. But I didn't really go down the rabbit hole.
Did people always feel it was inevitable one of these systems would exist, or did it feel like
no? We thought it was dead forever. We thought
just can't be done.
No, not that it couldn't be done. Some of the early writings in Cypherpunk literally theorized a system like this. The system will need to be based off, like Jim McCoy and the guys at Mojo Nation came so close. And that had like Brain Cohen, who had done BitTorrent. So everyone had done pieces of it, but just the right pieces coming together at the right time with the right nurturing environment, just, that takes something, sometimes just lightning in a bottle happens.
Yep.
Fast forward to 2013, thankfully, Adam didn't want to give up. So he was pestering me all throughout 2013, saying, Austin, I need to talk to you. I need your help. This Bitcoin shit is real.
Okay.
He had been looking at it more seriously because, he had been busy. He had sold his company that he created with a bunch of X0 knowledge guys. They sold it successfully to, I think EMC ended up buying it, company called PiCorp. And he was their CTO, and he was so he was busy doing a post-acquisition. But I think he was finishing his vesting period at PiCorp and had really begun to dive in and really started looking at all the ways that it didn't meet the cypherpunk ideal. It wasn't anonymous enough. It wasn't private enough. It was very hard to upgrade without disenfranchising early users by performing regular hard forks,
right,
which went against the ideals of Bitcoin. So he was spending a lot of time with Greg Maxwell, with Peter Woolley, in the Bitcoin Wizards chat room, coming up with a bunch of ideas. How would we do this? How could we add things like, blinded signatures, or how could we add some cryptography to make privacy, confidential transactions, for instance, was something he and Greg Maxwell started coming up with. But they were talking about how could we actually bootstrap or layer in more fungibility, more privacy to a system that's already built. And so that's where the concept of sidechains had come up. Could you add extensible pegged networks pegged to Bitcoin to allow extensibility to happen on separate chains where you don't need to invent a new currency? So it was December 10th, 2013. Adam finally flew to Montreal, and he said, I'm flying to Montreal. I will not let you ignore me another day.
What day was that?
December 10th, 2013.
Okay.
He said, read up as much as you can on Bitcoin before the meeting, because I'm not going to let you ignore me anymore.
Okay.
Thank you, Adam. So we sat down, and he essentially told me, you got to go down to the Bitcoin rabbit hole. I was able to do it quite quickly, actually, because I had all the history. Like, I had done eCash. I knew a lot of... So by 7-8 days later, I'd read everything on the internet, because I had this ability to process information, but I had read almost everything on the internet. I had watched most of the speeches at 2x speed on YouTube. I just devoured everything I could. And Adam
Did you find any holes?
Sorry?
Did you find any holes in it? Were there things you're like, I'm not sure about this?
No, just the ones that Adam and some of the Bitcoin core developers were kind of talking about. The system's very hard to upgrade without disenfranchising people.
Okay.
There were some exoteric attacks, but they would already been discussed. So, some stuff that Bitcoin still actually has some vulnerabilities to. There were attacks at the mining pool level with BGP routing, so you could reroute payments in mining pools. There were problems with Stratum, but some of these are known, and like some of the work that Matt Corello did around Better Hash, and that still needs more community support. That just separates out hashing mining pools from the votes. So this was something that we were trying to do at Blockstream, but we're trying to do too much. But it makes mining way more democratic and way more decentralized, because even though you pool hashing and mining pool rewards, you don't have to pool the policy vote. So everyone gets to vote on an upgrade or vote on a protocol upgrade without having to give the mining pool their vote. So, and it has a bunch of other improvements in how Stratum is working and how the mining pools are more democratic. There were various network level attacks that, if someone controls the entire network, BGP routing, and causes massive network forks, there are ways to do, various, and these are now written up and academically studied in Bitcoin Core, and people are talking about various responses to those. But I was in, like, I was talking to Adam at this point 12 hours a day over Skype, talking about what kind of company would we create, what would be the principles, how do we make sure we weren't a centralizing force, because if we bring together all these core developers, we want to make sure that we don't end up becoming the Borg. So we were designing contracts that actually gave the developers more rights than the company had. So we actually gave all the developers this morality clause that they could say if the company ever acts against the interest of the Bitcoin community, they could trigger a massive payout that would almost like bankrupt the company, which was like totally like counter to any, like, and I had to sell investors on this. I had to go to investors and say, essentially, we're giving our employees a poison pill that can blow up the company if we ever act immoral.
But required.
Yeah, but I was good at raising money. And I literally went to our investors and I sold them on the idea. This was the pitch. Everyone thought we had this master plan for Blockstream, that we had some like secret revenue plan to take over or keep block sizes small so we could profit. We had no plan. I literally went to our investors and I said, you need to look at Bitcoin as the Manhattan Project of the financial singularity. The world of finance will be completely remade with Bitcoin at the core. And it is literally like creating atomic fusion that Feynman and Teller and Oppenheimer did. And the responsibilities and the ethics and the number of brains you need around that project to invent that financial singularity and to think through all of the follow-on technologies, because coming out of the Manhattan Project gave us the next 70 years of economic progress in the world. It gave us computers, it gave us new forms of math, radio telegraphy, oscillography, like you name it, the number of offshoot technologies and the ethical implications, because all of a sudden you invented something that had the power or that could potentially, in the wrong hands or misused, bring about the end of society. I mean, the Manhattan, and so I literally said, we want to create the Manhattan Project of Bitcoin. Bring together all the scientists. I said, we're going to need a shitload of money, and I have no idea how we're going to make money, but we'll figure it out. I went to 7 or 8 investors that I trusted who had the vision. Reid Hoffman was one of them.
LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I mean, Reid and I knew each other. He and I had had a relationship. He funded Mozilla and was on the board of Mozilla because Reid is a very deep thinker. Mm-hmm. He had been there at the early days of the internet. He was friends with a lot of the guys from Creative Commons. They had done work on how do you design the protocols of the internet to keep it out of the United States hands when the ITF took over standards and made it so that domain name space wasn't just controlled by the US. When Creative Commons was writing the rules to make sure that not everything on the internet could be copywritten, that we would have copy left and Creative Commons licensing. So Reid funded Mozilla to make sure that it wasn't just Google and Microsoft defining the standards of the web. And I knew Reed to be a deeply ethical and long-term thinker. That's ultimately why we chose him to invest in the company, and I was never eternally grateful and never regretted that. And he actually helped us. Like some of the other people we brought in, Danny Hillis was one of the original creators of some of these internet protocols. He was there at the beginning of the internet. And so we brought him very early on to talk to us and advise some of our people saying, okay, how do we develop? We don't want to create standards bodies because standards bodies go against Bitcoin. But how do we make sure that some of these things have some principles or some standards that follow kind of like the ITF, loosely based consensus? So we were able to bring in some incredible people who advised us early on how to think through the evolution of the Bitcoin ecosystem and how to design a company and how to design, and some stuff we did right, some stuff we failed miserably at.
How did you balance the idea of building a company, which ultimately would want to be profitable, with also wanting to support the Bitcoin network, an open source, network? Because they're intrinsically linked, but they're also two separate entities.
They don't need to be, but it was unique. So we had examples of Red Hat. There are open source companies who have done incredibly well supporting and generally, in fact, the best open source projects have a whole bunch of companies who have learned to make money in the open source ecosystem who can then fund it. But at the time, you need to remember, no one was spending money on the core developers. I mean, almost all the core developers had day jobs elsewhere.
Yep.
They had the incredible amount of stress and personal attacks. They were being trolled. Some of them had bounties put out on their lives, essentially for assassination politics.
Didn't that crazy Romanian guy who died recently in Costa Rica, he was going after Peter Willey, wasn't he?
That was one of them,
Yeah, I mean, that's public knowledge.
Yeah. But I mean, when you're Peter and you're trying to do good work in an open source system and all of a sudden people are putting bounties on your head to have you killed, it's not exactly conducive to a healthy,
Nope.
And so we looked at it and we said, we got to help these guys. We got to give them stable salaries. We got to give them freedom to continue to work. We got to give them financial support. And no one else was doing it. Coinbase wasn't investing in the open source community. Most of the people getting rich off Bitcoin in mining weren't contributing. To their credit, some people, like the guys from Chaincode Labs, had been thinking about it, but they didn't know the developers. And it was one of my big regrets. They came to us early on and said, how can we help? And we were kind of like, we got this.
Well, they're helping now.
Oh, they've so much love for those guys. And, frankly, when Blockstream went through some of its changes and some of our co-founders needed to find a new environment, because startups are messy. Sometimes it, doesn't always work. I personally, frankly, was doing too much at Blockstream and I wasn't taking care of my health. And so at one point I needed to kind of step down and leave. And Adam took over the kind of reins of leadership. That wasn't easy on the company, How
was that between you and Adam?
I'm eternally grateful that he stepped up and took it on. And I've learned the company can't have a backseat driver. Company needs one leader.
Yep.
And so I couldn't be in the corner telling Adam everything I would do differently. It wasn't fair to him. It wasn't fair to the company. And the board needed to support him.
This is my problem with DAOs.
Oh yeah, DAOs are a joke in their current form.
I was just in a meeting previously, about the football idea, and somebody said to me, well, why don't you do a DAO? I was like, would you run your company with a DAO? No. I was like, why?
More importantly, it all comes down to human governance. And show me a single DAO that can be encoded with the logic and the nuance needed for human decision making.
Exactly.
That needs to evolve for new facts over time. And the whole idea of DAOs are that if they are upgradable, they're upgradable by some vote. So literally, you're going to take the worst parts of democracy with the worst parts of encoded human nuance and logic and combine them. We're 51% of the people who can be convinced to vote one way. We can't even get people to show up and vote responsibly in a political election, much less look at most corporate votes. How many people show up and vote for anything that a company actually does? So you end up having these autocratic boards that are run by small groups of power leaders, and people just go along with it, except for when you have a minority shareholder group, in the case of shareholder takeovers, that force the board to take someone onto the board. And then usually they get paid off with company assets and sent packing through greenmail. So when you actually study how governance in companies work, you understand that the idea of a DAO is just a ridiculous concept with today's technology. It wasn't easy, I think, but Adam and I have been friends for 21 years. At the end of the day, we remain friends. We talk regularly. I support him and I support what he's doing at the company. It hasn't been easy. I think he was pushed out of his traditional comfort role as a scientist, and he had to learn some new skills as CEO. But he's doing incredibly well. I mean, the company just had a monster round.
The suite of products they have now is incredible. I was on the website the other day, and first time I've been up for a while. It's like, holy shit! They do this, they do this, they do this, they do this. They're like the suite. It's a full suite of Bitcoin products.
A huge amount of those are not for profit. And we literally told our investors, we will have to subsidize some products that are just good for the ecosystem that you may never have a profit. But the idea, and you asked why a company, was because if you look at most companies that can affect change, they're usually driven by a capitalist and economic engine that gives them power and growth and revenue. You can call them good or bad in various situations, but Google has promoted certain things I really believe in. They've done also a huge amount of damage to privacy and to, some unintended consequences. That's why I went, jokingly, they stopped using that "don't be evil" because they were getting mocked.
It was like a confession. It's like the day they did this, like, we admit we're now evil.
Well,
what
it was
the fuck.
But that's why when we created Zero Knowledge, I jokingly said we're going to call it "can't be evil."
Yes.
And so, but we actually, even then, the developers asked me to stop using it because they pointed out that evil is such a subjective term, what one person determines, and they didn't want it being mocked against us the same way it became a mocking term, because they were like, okay, we think we can't be evil because we're designing things with encryption, but other people may not agree with our decisions on how we're using encryption. We actually had written out all these principles of what can't be evil means. Voluntary, fully encrypted protocols, attack vectors, always like security through transparency, not through security through obscurity.
Was the Google kicker? Was it when they agreed to censor content in China? I'm trying to remember. Were they not in China, and then they went into China but agreed to censor things like Tiananmen Square, and that's when they.
Well, Google ended up pulling out of China mostly.
But when they went, was that when they removed the "Don't Be Evil"? Was it about that time?
There were a number of things that were kind of going on at the same time.
Yeah.
I think they had started doing some AI research with the military, and then their employees protested that, which is still a very big open issue. Because if you look at what's happening with the Chinese and the Chinese use of technologies where it is militarized, fully state-funded, and they're making rapid progress, some would argue that actually using the best of Silicon Valley tech with Defense Department spending. I mean, hell, DARPA funded the internet. A lot of advancements in technologies of energy have come from government funding, advanced scientific funding that the private sector can't do. And so some argue, Peter Thiel and some of these guys have argued that if you don't actually align with the government to accelerate the development of these technologies and to become proficient at them, that you're leaving the United States at a huge disadvantage. Other people argue that why should we trust the U.S. government, who has been, frankly, a little bit war happy and loves to use militarization and as a foreign policy tool versus the State Department? Why should we equip them with better access to technology that makes it cheaper, faster, better to be kind of the armchair police of the world?
One of those impossible decisions. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Yeah. But anyway, so it can't be evil was kind of something we played with. But the principles and the founding of the company was just so misunderstood. Everyone kind of started, attacking the company, that we were trying to act like some evil overlords or centralizing force, that we were, even the Blocksize wars, which was really hard on the team. And I think on me too, because, I was seeing our name dragged through the mud by some really dishonest players. And I don't think their names even deserve credit, but I've made this analogy before, but
I know who you're talking about.
yeah. And it was just such a dishonest argument because if you're talking about the security protocols for a nuclear reactor, do you really think everyone who uses power has an equal say on that? So the guy who orders power from the nuclear reactor, do you think he should have an equal say on how the protocols of your nuclear reactor should work?
No, of course
versus the scientists who actually build nuclear reactors. That's the one Nick Szabo always laughs about and used as an example. He was like, 90% of the people arguing about this have no say in it because they don't have the scientific qualifications to understand what they're debating. I use the analogy of...
Hold on, doesn't that go back to Plato's argument against democracy?
Well...
Yeah,
but not all things should be a democratic vote because not all people should have equal say in all arguments. So the analogy I've used is, let's say that airplanes are invented. It's early on in the creation of the aviation industry. And one early entrepreneur is really, really smart, and he buys airplane.com, the domain name. And he's an incredible marketer. He sets up ticket sales, and he's an incredible promoter of airplanes. He sells more tickets than anyone. And he promotes to everyone, get on an airplane, get on an airplane. And then all of a sudden he starts screaming about the cost of airplane tickets to Hawaii because the planes aren't big enough. And so he comes in and says, okay, I want you guys to start strapping fold-down chairs on the wings of airplanes. Because if you can add 30% more passengers to the plane, I can drop the cost of an airplane ticket. And if the cost is cheaper, then more people will fly. And we need to build airplane tickets for the world. And a bunch of engineers say, you know what, we're more interested in the long-term viability of the airplane industry. And if we start killing passengers who are strapped to our wings, or we weigh down a plane with too much weight and the plane crashes, we're going to do more damage to the ecosystem. So give us a few years to design a new plane that can actually handle more weight. And this person says, you don't understand economics. I understand how to sell more airplane tickets because I own airplane.com. And I should be able to control how the industry goes because I own airplane.com. Now, I won't use names here, and I don't think...
Jerry, do you know who he's talking about?
Roger.
Anyway.
Everyone knows you'll be talking about Roger.
Okay, but...
I have a tricky relationship with him. I'll come back to it.
But literally, the person comes up and says, you engineers are trying to hijack the entire industry because you refuse to do something that I believe is safe, that you're telling me I'm not qualified to know that's not safe. And spins up lies, spins up an entire economic attack, hijacks every single discussion, literally make an argument that they're not qualified to make. And so it becomes really hard to have an honest... I refused ever to step in the room with this person and have a debate with them because I just refuse to debate with intellectual, dishonest people.
Yeah, I have a tricky relationship with Roger in that I completely agree with you on your thesis. I trust the engineers of Bitcoin to make the decisions. I trust Greg Maxwell, Peter Willey, and Macarello, and all the smart people who work on the background. I trust them, absolutely. Roger has been very good to me privately in regards to one of my lawsuits and was willing to help me out significantly without anything in return. He didn't like most people would have expected he asked something in return. So I think it's a shame Bitcoin lost Roger, but I think that was down to Roger. But I think it's a shame he didn't recognize what you're saying and was just still out there promoting it.
The great thing about being a god and being Bitcoin Jesus is you can always have redemption. So, if he's willing to get back on a cross and crucify himself, I think people might actually invite him back. But are you familiar with quantum thinking?
Why am I aware? Somebody else... Hold on. Did you tell me about that the other day when we were on the Zoom, or did somebody else tell me about it?
So Nick Szabo coined the
Yes, Nick Szabo. Yeah, and I read the article. Yeah,
so the idea of quantum thinking is that, when you truly understand a topic, you understand it. It's also used in the term in sci-fi grok, which is, Michael Valentine Smith. When you grok something, you understand it at so many levels that you can both love and hate it at the same time. You understand it in its duality. Quantum thinking is, the idea that I can hold two equally opposing thoughts and I can have I can fight either side of an argument. Debate clubs have been doing this for years. When you randomly get thrown on either side of a debate and you need to prove your debating skills by either not just arguing for the side you agree, but can you make an equally impassioned argument for the side you don't agree to? That shows that you understand a topic well enough that you actually can look at both sides. And so I can hold...
What journalists should do.
Yeah, I mean, I can hold both realities. I have heard and seen Roger to be very generous on a personal level to people and extend support and financially or otherwise. I can hold that he doesn't have to be an evil, horrible person to also hold the belief that he's been totally intellectually dishonest, lied, and hurtful, and launched attacks at people I care about and made their lives very miserable. Both things can be equally true.
Yeah, that's, it's fair.
Human beings are complex individuals. They're not always one thing, right? I've made tons of mistakes in my life. I've been really shitty to some people in my life I care about because I was dealing with my own demons at the time. That does not make me necessarily evil. It's just at that moment, I wasn't the best version of me. And hopefully I have enough maturity that when I am at a different state of my life, I can go back and clean up that mess and deal with it honestly.
Yeah, well, we will see with Roger. He's been very quiet recently, so I have no idea. I would like to see him come back and do the necessary things.
I
for
think
that to happen.
various parts of the community forking off was the best example of what Bitcoin is.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a great stress test.
Yeah, but when it also allows you to let all the crazies go sit on Crazy Island.
We still got a few crazies.
But eventually, they'll look at what happened. They forked themselves 3-4 times.
Yeah.
They saw how hard it was to actually build a healthy open source community. I mean, one of the first speakers that we brought in to the Bitcoin Scaling Conference in Montreal was an expert on open source toxicity, toxicity in the open source community. Everyone was so focused on the block size rewards, but she was this expert of the University of Montreal McGill who had studied how apathy, arrogant, some of the worst parts of kind of geek or, can be kind of very arrogant thinking, lack of listening skills was destroying various open source communities. And they went through examples of open source projects that had forked, that had built dysfunction in them. And so we were trying to think about some of these issues, like and a lot of them, under the guidance of some of the Bitcoin wizards, just developed very healthy protocols for how do you deal with decision making, how do you deal with meritocracy, so that people get their RFCs or their BIPs, which was based off kind of the RFC and ITF protocol process. They could get their BIPs considered, but if they wanted to make the change, they had to build enough consensus in the community to be able to, and they needed to study a whole bunch of comments that would allow people to do proper risk assessment, because people don't understand that in traditional software projects, for every 10 hours or every 100 hours of coding you do, you might do 10 hours or 15 hours of tooling, testing, and QA. NASA developed the model for anything that went into the space shuttle, that for every 100 hours of coding, you did 900 hours of testing.
Damn.
Because their attitude was that we can never, ever lose someone in space.
Yeah.
And if we do, we will ruin the entire space industry for the planet. And they had that kind of approach to engineering that was risk avoidance. And it took principles from civic engineering, like when a bridge gets built, they stress test and they think about anything that can go wrong. And you literally design around that principle of this bridge can never fall down. Nuclear engineering has the same safety requirements. Bitcoin Core took that approach, and that comes at a cost. It moves slow. It builds risk tolerance. And so the amount of unit tests and the amount of testing and backwards testing, that's what led Bitcoin Core to discover flaws in OpenSSL that have gone undiscovered for almost 15 years on the internet.
Wow.
Because they were doing back testing and cryptography testing that no one else had invented. They invented a series of tools for secure coding, like Gideon, which allows you to build things and verify your builds to make sure that no one had invented on the internet, which
Yeah. I wonder what Ethereum's approach to that. It's like for every 100 hours coding, they do like 25 minutes testing.
they took a different approach. They took the approach of
Fast breaking things.
move fast and break things.
Move fast, break things, lose your money.
I personally think that, that was like taking nuclear energy, which was the power of blockchains and the power to create currencies, and essentially putting it in a kitty box and handing it out to children. And we saw the effect of that. ICO scams,
DeFi hacks
regularly. When you're building a house of cards on a bed of sand, you are going to have something that falls down regularly. And if the attitude is, who cares who gets hurt? We're just innovating. We're just moving fast. Then you bring regulatory risk on the entire ecosystem. You bring burning of people when their first experience with DeFi or with coins is losing all their money in an ICO scam. The moral hazard risk to what you've created is quite high. But to be honest, people love to beat up on Vitalik for this. Like I said, this dual thinking. I think Vitalik has a lot to answer for, but at least in the world of shitcoining and scams, he actually just stuck around. You look at most of the people who created Ethereum around him, they were all liars and scammers, and they profited hugely, and they left him holding the bag.
I do like that Bitcoin's cohorts are nuclear engineers and space scientists. That's pretty fucking cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's necessary.
Well, and, and those people need support, and they need an environment to create in that is outside of commercial interest. Even some of the accusations about like Blockstream that got so ridiculous at one point, like we took money from Digital Currency Group, frankly, because Barry Silbert and Meltem Demirors at the time were incredible investors. Mm-hmm. They invested in all of the Bitcoin exchanges, and we knew we needed to have better relationship with exchanges if we wanted to get things like Liquid and side chains and adopted. We took a small amount investment, very minority, like a six-figure check when we were doing $21 million, or actually they came in on our Series A. So, small six-figure checks when we're doing, a $57 million round. But everyone then, and at the time, that was just DCG. That was the capital. A couple years later, they created a new fund with MasterCard. And so there's these charts, conspiracy charts on the internet.
I've seen them.
That show that MasterCard controls Blockstream, or the Bilderbergs control it.
I know, the Bilderbergs.
Totally ridiculous. Has no bearing on the truth. We took some money from AXA, a non-minority, non-voting. Their name was first on the investment list because we named the investors alphabetically, not by size of investment. AXA, Strategic Ventures. The insurance company was looking at uses of Bitcoin and technology in the insurance industry. Frankly, they're thinking very long term, and the potential for Bitcoin for insurance industries is massive. Like, insurance industry has to deal with payouts and has to deal with creating annuity funds over 20, 30-year life terms for policies. What better asset to own than Bitcoin if you're thinking about long-term gains in a deflationary world when your current currency is being debased at 20% a year? Aside from that, you look at foreign markets where they're trying to deal with payments and micropayments and you can't charge someone $5 a month for insurance when the cost of a transaction in that part of the world is $15 minimum transaction fee. So if you're not looking at micropayments and things like Lightning Network to be able to do payment networks for an insurance, then you're ignoring 3 billion people in a foreign market. Mm-hmm. So, the opportunities for insurance companies to take advantage of Bitcoin are huge. And we were looking at, could we use some of the ways insurance companies use transparency of products, reinsurance. There's a whole bunch of risk in the system that we thought Bitcoin and blockchains could benefit. So that's why you take on an investor, so you can learn from each other. And the fact that I guess their chairman had been involved in AXA, in Bilderberg, and attending, I never knew. I found out later. And frankly, some of the conspiracies,
I know.
some people believe them or not, but I've been at some of those conferences. I've never been to the Bilderberg, but I've been invited into conferences that are very, very, very exclusive, that are like 300, 400 people invite only, that have, attendees who are heads of state, who have, the same attendees who go to Bretton Woods. Frankly, I welcome the opportunity to go into those rooms because I get to learn from these people. I got invited into some central bank meetings that were hugely informative for me, teaching me how central bankers are thinking about Bitcoin so I could think of how we would react to their moves.
How do you think about the progress of Bitcoin now?
I couldn't be more excited,
Yep.
couldn't be more happy. Some of the things that I think but the community were very smart to. You need to remember there are some smart people involved in Bitcoin who are thinking at layers and levels of strategy that are 10 to 15 times deeper than anything you or I operate on. And I consider myself a deep strategic thinker.
Well, if it's 10 from you, it's a good 1,000 from me.
I mean, I went to, at one point, Greg Maxwell, and I was trying to argue a point. And you never get humbled faster or quicker until Greg schools you. Because, you want to talk about an incredible mind. One of my greatest moments of joy, frankly, was I got to attend a meeting that I had set up with one of the top cryptographers in the world who had invented some of the cryptography that's just now being considered in Bitcoin, in Taproot. And he's a professor at Stanford. And we were trying to evaluate whether or not certain algorithms should be trusted yet, even though they've been out there for 12 years. And this guy invented the algorithm. So I organized a meeting with Adam Back and Greg Maxwell. Adam Back has a PhD and is a learned cryptographer. Greg Maxwell is self-taught. He is just a brilliant mind who has studied and I watched them at the whiteboard, and I literally felt like I was at the Manhattan Project, watching Feynman and Teller working. It was like this beautiful mind moment, and I was barely carrying on the conversation. I've hung out with cryptographers enough that I understood and they're doing math and they're doing protocols, and they finally end it. And Adam goes to this professor, he goes, "Well, you wrote the algorithm. Would you trust all your money on it?" And he goes, "Nah, not for another 10 years. And this is the level of thinking that because we've seen crypto algorithms fail. Mm-hmm. So when you have projects that are move fast and break things, let's use the algorithm that just came out 2 years ago. Some of the snark zero knowledge proof stuff that is being used and contemplated. We've seen 4 or 5 of the zero knowledge protocols break. Zero Cash and Zuku at least track cryptography, and he understands, but some of the protocols early on that they were using have had flaws on them. And so, cryptography is not somewhere where you want to use the latest, greatest. You use the proven and the strongest that has the most reliability on it, because that's risk avoidance. And so I was arguing with Greg Maxwell, trying to argue actually for a more political approach to the block size wars. Because I was getting beat up and I was getting yelled at by all the industry players that who wanted a 248 or some. And I was like, Greg, come on. SegWit will buy some, but, can't we do that just to appease people, just to alleviate some of the pressure in the community? Because, and Greg is like, Austin, I'm sorry, we do not build bridges based off alleviating the community pressure, because people, we don't add 4 lanes to a bridge when it's unsafe just because people want to get to work faster. He goes, we have to do what's right from an engine. And he proceeded to go through with me all of the things that I had never considered. He walked through me how all the exchanges had done no engineering work and were stuffing the blockchain. That Coinbase still, for years later, did not do proper batch ordering and was still dragging its feet. And he was like, if they continue to kick the can down and expect the open source engineers to do risky engineering because they won't invest in using the protocol right, where does that end us up with? He goes, we need to have some constraints because these people need to start using the resource properly, like a scarce resource. And there's 50 things they can do on an engineering level that would make their use of the blockchain so much more efficient. And they just don't do it because they're too busy adding shit coins, which make them money, as opposed to investing in infrastructure. And he was right.
He was right.
And certain exchanges started to do proper batch ordering, did proper use of it, and they found their cost on Bitcoin lowered incredibly. And Bitcoin would have been way worse off because we would be less decentralized and more susceptible to attacks if he had been wrong on that. And so, even in the New York agreement, we went up against Barry Silbert. Barry Silbert was on the wrong side of an argument. I appreciate Barry for all he's done, but that doesn't mean he was right in this instance. And frankly, Wences is the only person in the Bitcoin ecosystem who had the moral fortitude to actually come back and say, I was wrong. A whole bunch of people on the wrong side of the New York agreement have yet to come back, but my life doesn't change based off getting an apology from them. But it's just nice to see people like Wences actually stand up and say, hey, I actually was on the wrong side of this.
Yeah, and that's totally fair because, look, I don't have the knowledge you guys have. In 2017, both arguments made sense to me. It's like, oh yeah, more transactions, that makes sense. It scales faster. Oh yeah, smaller block size. Decentralization makes better. But I ended up just siding with the people I trusted in the end. Who do I believe? Huh? Jameson, Rob, whoever. But I've had conversations with Jameson considered larger blocks. I think even at one point Adam was having conversations about it. Like everyone's had the conversation.
Listen, 248 was a viable proposal, and Peter Woolley had actually coded up, and things were being considered. But that was before Luke figured out how to do SegWit as a soft fork, and that was just an incredible revelation because once we saw that we could roll in SegWit as a soft fork, it just opened up a realm of opportunities that fit so many. It allowed us to do protocol versioning. It allowed us to deal with changes we needed for Lightning to become viable, which would give us a proper L2 layer 2 because we could finally deal with transaction malleability because that was the one thing blocking it. So when we finally realized that we could do SegWit as a soft fork, that just became the best engineering option. And when the best engineering option presents itself, you don't go back and say, okay, we're going to engineer an entire ecosystem for the world based off a broken, flawed compromise when the better engineering solution is there. And so the engineers stuck by the principles, and that had consensus. 80% of the coders who were actually coding and working on the project all agreed with the roadmap to make SegWit the priority, and then to do block size extensions through the extended block size you get from SegWit, and then focus on Lightning and developing layer 2. And they were right. And look at now we have Strike, now we have what's happening in Venezuela, now we have just a wealth of opportunities coming from proper L2 engineering, as opposed to some other projects that have tried to do L2 with sharding and with all these other hacks that, frankly, like I said, is a house cards built on a bed of sand.
So when you're thinking about Bitcoin now and maybe Greg and Adam, what are the risks you tend to think about now? Because my assumption is over time, certain risks aren't as big as they are. Like there's other things you have to focus on over time as Bitcoin becomes bigger.
Well, I won't speak for Adam or Greg.
Yeah, okay, fair, yeah.
Some of the more interesting discussions I've been having lately are with Jeff Booth. I think he's one of the most incredible minds in the Bitcoin space and such a welcome addition because he understands the language of central bankers. He understands the language of economists who, are bought into this MMT monetary, bullshit. And in fact, some of them are out there actually advocating for never-ending printing of money and never-ending deficits. And he's actually gone through and just proven from a very valid basis in his Price of Tomorrow book, which is the best book I recommend for even hardcore Bitcoiners haven't read this book because it comes at Bitcoin as the solution to a set of problems that they may understand inherently, but they don't understand. He comes at it from the fact that we have two exponential curves that are about to run into each other. One is the exponential curve of the singularity. So technology advancing at exponential rates should make things deflationary, should make things in our life cheaper, faster, and more abundant. The only reason they're not is because we have a central bank that's based off inflationary targets, right? A central bank that has inflation as its core goal, which, by the way, promotes more consumerism, more, buy more, spend more, damage the planet more.
Yeah.
The effect it's having on the entire planet from just instead of figuring out how to get things cheaper and faster and more abundant, you have to do more, right? And that drives prices up and keeps prices artificially up. Like the price of a cell phone my iPhone 14 should, if it followed Moore's law, be $100. Instead, it's $1,500, $1,800, $2,000. That's not because of anything that Apple is doing. Apple needs to keep its profits up, yes, but it's to promote bad central banking and the government involved in central banking. And so Jeff understands this, that if you actually wanted to bring these technologies to the masses and you wanted to bridge the democratization of these benefits and you actually want to improve everyday, like especially the middle class, because this is one of the biggest dangers, is that we're going to build a society of haves and have-nots. And all the Bitcoiners who think they can go live in citadels have something coming to them. Because frankly, Jeff has this incredible line. Show me any point in history when you could build walls big enough to keep the haves away from the have-nots, especially in a world of singularity tech. So not even with Bitcoiners inside of their citadel as the targets. Let's imagine in a world, and this will get into some vulnerable world hypothesis. Let's imagine that I'm a Venezuelan student. I'm 15, 16. I've seen my mother and sisters raped by gangs. I've seen a dictator who's totally corrupted the system. Frankly, stole Bitcoiners, miners, ASICs. Like people don't talk about this, but it actually happened.
Yeah, it did.
I know some of those people who were actually had to flee and were running the ASIC miners who are now expats, had their entire Bitcoin mining operation stolen by the Venezuelan secret police. And I try and make my way to the United States. I'm told I'm not of the right economic opportunity. I'm told I'm not the right color. So I get sent back and I land in Mexico somewhere where I'm also dealing with, gang warfare, total corrupt state due to bad drug policy, narco-capitalism. I'm angry. I'm frustrated. I'm pissed off. I've seen my entire family wiped out through corruption of money and state. I see all these people living in the United States with their walls built. What do you think is going to happen in 10 years? You don't think someone like that isn't going to go to the university and download some plans for CRISPR-55, for synthetic biology, for autonomous drone technology, and say, you know what? I'm going to inflict my will on you. I'm going to send a fleet of drones with, to disperse COVID-55 that's weaponized, custom designed, and will wipe out 20 million people. Or, anyone can be a victim. I'm going to do it against the Jews if the people is, anti-Semitic and believes that the Jews control the world's money, which is ridiculous and hateful. But, whoever they want to do it. One man's, what was the famous saying?
One man's terrorist
is another man's freedom fighter, right?
Yeah.
But this person, when they have access to exponential technologies, this is Nick Bostrom's vulnerable world hypothesis, which has been obsessing me lately, which is if we don't reduce the threat profile, because as a cypherpunk, I was kind of taught to think about the world in threat modeling. So you approach everything based off threat models, and you design. And we did this at Zero Knowledge extensively. We would publish threat models that essentially go through and you think through how can this system be attacked at every single layer, at every single level. And so when I'm thinking about the future and I'm thinking about how do we bring the world into this hyper-Bitcoinization, one of the biggest concerns I have is that we don't deal with lifting all boats equally fast enough. So, that's why Venezuela is so important. But it's why it's also important that we have that happen in multiple Latin American countries. I think it's important that, if we could see 6 or 7 Latin American countries do what currently is being done in Venezuela, where we have democratically elected, responsible governments using Bitcoin and using Bitcoin financing to create some of the best financial products, better as alternatives to IMF debt, which is going to piss off the IMF. But I think you can actually build a better bond product financed by Bitcoin and actually start saving some of these nations in the currency wars that are about to happen.
So it sounds to me then you're starting to think about the things you're thinking about with regard to Bitcoin are not so much contained now within the protocol. It's the products we can build outside of it that can help move society forward.
It's the society and it's the impact and it's the transition path to of how do we make sure that Bitcoin is the economic ladder? Bitcoin is the economic ladder that can save the middle class. It can move people up the economic levers outside of central banks. How do you do it in the United States? Right? When you have a system that is so US dollar, US Fed, and the US Fed central banks are going to do what US Fed central banks are going to do. But we've seen at the local level, Miami, New York, mayors. So, Salim Ismail, I don't know if you know Salim Ismail. Salim is doing some incredible work at his thesis, and he and I have discussed this for a number of years, is that you can do it at the municipal level much more democratic governance, city hacking than you can do at the federal level. Because at the federal level, it's all regulatory capture, it's all like politics and long-term interest, and you have to lobby. But at the municipal level, which actually makes a difference in everybody's everyday life, what if we hyper-Bitcoinize a city? What if you do it based off good candidates, like actual good candidates? So there's this incredible internet entrepreneur, Farhad Mohat, who is running a political initiative called the Good Party that is looking at using how to break the two-party system inside of the United States.
A bit like Andrew Yang's trying to.
Yeah. So how do you actually use this system to get third-party candidates actually on the ballot and break the logjam? What if you were to combine Bitcoin, like a Bitcoin candidate, with good politics that's not funded by lobbyists, not funded by dark money, that's totally transparent?
Bitcoin fixes this.
Bitcoin fixes this.
Well, listen, I mean, we got $1 trillion market cap right now. You go forward 5 years and we may have a $10 trillion market cap. Things have become a lot easier because you have capital.
Well, more importantly, you can start actually representing politicians who have Bitcoin and the interest of financial sovereignty, financial independence of their citizens at their best interest. And the type of things you can do are amazing. I mean, I could blow your mind with some of the stuff we're thinking about and talking about, but like you could literally hijack an entire town, create Bitcoin incentive bonds for the citizenry, where you create a totally new tax incentive system where a candidate comes in and basically says, like, if you stay in the city for 5 to 7 years and you prove that you're working and staying in the city, you get, it's a new form of UBI backed by Bitcoin, you get access to a Bitcoin bond. You can use it, you can draw down and borrow fiat against it, but you never sell your Bitcoin. It's locked up over 7 years. You have to prove you're a citizen of the town. You have to prove that you're, a viable economic player in our local citizens. So you vote, you stay, you live, and we'll give you this Bitcoin asset, and you can draw down regularly fiat loans against your Bitcoin asset, against it, to finance your life, to finance self-improvement, university, start a company, start a job. And we will literally give you, as a citizen of our town, a Bitcoin bond, and at the 7-year vesting, when you've proven that the entire thing vests and it becomes yours. And you pay taxes on all your fiat conversion rates. It creates tax revenue for the state. You could literally hijack a town and use Bitcoin and a good candidate to create economic, like all the people fleeing California and the taxes going to Miami, all the people trying to figure out, we could pick a town of 20 or 30,000 people, get a few Bitcoiners to, back and underwrite the bond. You could do amazing things. And there are people who are talking about some of this stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the economic reality is starting to play out now with Bitcoin. We've seen it at I say a micro scale, but in El Salvador. We're seeing the reality of it playing out there now, the volcano bonds, the airdropping of Bitcoin to the population, using laws to encourage people to adopt Bitcoin technology so people can use it. We're starting to see some smaller parts of these
sorry,
ideas.
I might have spoke before. I was talking about Venezuela and El Salvador. I meant El Salvador.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the Bitcoin city.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, what Blockstream is doing with and Adam and the group who are underwriting it, it's incredible. It is going to, I think, shock the world and rock the world. In a world of negative bonds, I mean, last year's the best performing bond product in the world was MicroStrategy's bond, right? I think that I have not verified that claim, but I heard it Michael Saylor claim, and I have no reason to disbelieve that. That was a Bitcoin product. I think the Venezuelan bond might be one of the best performing bonds in a world of negative bond interest
The El
rates.
Salvador bond.
The El Salvador volcano bond might be one of the best performing bonds. Now, some people have other opinions on it. I know. Sorry?
Of course.
Yeah, they're allowed to.
I
But
think Samsung announced it's 30% committed, verbally committed. If they close that bond, if there's a rapid closing of that bond, that's going to open the eyes to other people in the region who maybe are fucking pissed off with the IMF rules and interference.
So I heard part of your conversation. I was traveling with Nick Carter, where he mentioned you could get a similar risk exposure without having to do, and I understand that. Yes, you can if you understand financial world markets. But I don't think I think he missed was the opportunity.
The opportunity to stick your finger up to the IMF and go, let's
the
fucking do this.
opportunity to do a Bitcoin-powered volcano bond and the community support, the community wanting to come together and say, we can finance a central bank. Let's get out there and let's play at the level that Bitcoin should be able to play at. I think the Bitcoin community is going to come together, and I think the thing's going to sell out. And I think it will be one of the best performing bonds in the international bond market.
I agree, because they want to show the rest of the world and these large institutions that we can do it without you.
And what happens when you can bring that now to Costa Rica? What happens when you can bring that now to Nicaragua? Every other Latin American country is being approached and forced to remake its tax laws according to IMF rules, to take on massive amounts of debt. I mean, and this is Jeff Booth's argument that just this exponential debt curve that we're on, we are approaching levels of exponential debt that people just don't understand. And the US dollar will be the last to fail. The US dollar is actually probably a long-term, very good, stable fiat bet because it is the strongest. It is the world's reserve currency. But the cost of that is, a massive military industrial complex. It's, the U.S. government having to do, alliances with U.S. petrodollar backed, environmentally horrible, destructive, energy systems. Bitcoin does fix this. Like Bitcoin literally moves us off the oil, U.S. dollar, petro fiat world standard into a green energy backed ASIC mining world. And so, even Kevin O'Leary and some of the comments, did you have?
Yeah, hi, Kevin.
Yeah. I love Kevin. And when he was talking about some of the ESG boards and what he needs to do to get products in front of his companies, he doesn't even fully understand what's happening in the Bitcoin world. There are so many Bitcoin companies that are Bitcoin only, Bitcoin focused, that haven't had access to the public markets. Unfortunately, the only public market company that we have in the Bitcoin space, in the crypto space, is Coinbase. And argue what they want, but Coinbase at least got out.
We got some miners.
There are a few miners in the
Yeah.
Canadian markets. Yeah. There are people doing Bitcoin mining. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there just aren't enough public products. So there's trillions of dollars of capital in that sovereign wealth area that Kevin deals with that want access. He literally said on your show, I think, he has a target of moving from 3% allocation to 7% into crypto. And if we don't get enough Bitcoin companies public, viable, whether it's Blockstream to a direct listing or other Bitcoin-only companies that deserve to go public, then he doesn't have enough product to invest in. Now, some of them have figured out how to do it by owning ETFs, and hopefully we'll get a vehicle, an ETF vehicle going. But we'll see.
This was fascinating. I've got so much more I want to talk to you about. Okay, let's close this one here. We'll come back in the morning and we'll continue this and we'll talk about the vulnerable world hypothesis.
Great.
This is fascinating. Honestly, it's like Jeremy said, you're in the bathroom, like hanging on every word. This is one of the easiest interviews I've had to do. I've just had to sit and listen. It's fascinating. Thank you, Austin. Do you want to send anyone listening to anywhere? Do you want them to go, like, usually I ask, where to follow you? Like, do you want people to follow you or do you want them to go anywhere?
No, I'm retired.
Follow Bitcoin.
I'm planning a marriage this year. I'm getting married. I'm happily focused on living pseudonymously in Latin America.
Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Right, tomorrow morning, let's do this again.
Great.